Good afternoon, and welcome to the Protecting Critical Infrastructure, the new National Cybersecurity Strategy virtual panel. Please welcome INSA President Suzanne Wilson-Heckenberg.
Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us today. We have an incredible lineup of speakers ready to discuss the new National Cybersecurity Strategy, which will impact every sector of our country. But before we begin, I wanted to share how heartbroken we all are here at INSA about the recent passing of Lieutenant General Vince Stewart. He truly epitomized the American dream. Vince was a trailblazer, a role model, and an inspiration, not to mention just a genuinely sincere and kind man. As the 38th recipient of our William Oliver Baker Award, we plan to present the Medal of Achievement posthumously to his wife and family at our June 9th Baker Dinner, where we will honor his career and profound impact on the U.S. intelligence and national security community. Now, as far as our program goes today, as a reminder, this is a two-part panel discussion. We ask that when you have questions, you submit them in the question box to the right of your screen. Feel free to include both your name and organization, but it's not required. Our moderators will do their very best to get to your questions today. I would like to thank our supporting partner, the Bridge Network, for helping broaden the exposure of this event across the community. And finally, I would also like to thank our corporate partners, AT&T and Strongbox Cyber Solutions. We could not provide this type of thought leadership without the support of these partners. Now, it is my pleasure to introduce Janet Jirgi, CEO and President at Strongbox, and Janet will introduce today's moderator. Janet, I'm going to turn the mic and camera over to you.
Thank you, Suzanne. And on behalf of Strongbox Cyber Solutions, thank you for your leadership and the work that INSA does to foster these important discussions. I'm very grateful to be here today with all of you and to have this opportunity. Strongbox, just a real brief overview. We're very passionate about these issues. We focus across the IC, DoD, and the NT50s for insider threat, cybersecurity, securing our systems and critical infrastructure, taking systems through the accreditation process, especially those in the cloud. And we have a very intimate understanding of these challenges and how important it is. We work very closely with the national labs, as well as our industry partners working on Fed-only capabilities to help secure our great nation. Having this intimate understanding of these challenges is very important now more than ever for all of us to be working together. There's so much work out there for all of us, and you have my commitment to be there to support and to do what I can to be a good partner and leader. The goal is to overall increase our security posture here, to be more proactive and less reactive. So without further ado, I just wanted to have, now it's my pleasure to introduce our moderator, Bishop Garrison, who is INSA's Vice President for Policy. It's a new position he's been in for only a month, and he's hit the ground running. In this capacity, he's responsible for leading INSA's councils, task force, and other member-driven groups. A seasoned national security executive, veteran, and writer, Bishop has more than 2 decades of experience in the public and private sector, including leadership positions in presidential administrations and campaigns, nonprofits, startups, and the Department of Defense. So please join me in welcoming our moderator, Bishop Garrison.
Thank you so much, Shannon. I'm truly happy to be here with everyone today and truly happy to be a part of the INSA family here recently. So we're going to get right into it. Before we do so, I'm going to go ahead and introduce our speakers who are going to join our panel for today. First, we have Lauren Zaberick. She is with over 2 decades in the public sector. Lauren now serves as a senior policy advisor for the U.S. Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Agency, also known as CISA. She was formerly executive director of the cyber project at the Harvard Kennedy School of Government's Belfar Center, And prior to that, she served as an intelligence analyst at NGA following her 5 years of service in the United States Air Force. Also today with us is Brian Scott. Brian currently serves as Deputy Assistant National Cyber Director for Cyber Policy and Programs at the Office of the National Cyber Director in the Executive Office of the President of the United States. It's a long way of saying he works at the White House. He previously served as Director for Critical Infrastructure and Cybersecurity at the NSC and as Director for Policy at CISA. He joined the Department of Homeland Security in 2007 after a 28-year career in the United States Navy. Thank both of you for your tremendous service to our nation, and thank you for joining us today here at INSA. So just to get right into it, and Lauren, I'll start with you, then we'll go to Brian next, but we're here to talk about the National Cybersecurity Strategy. So for us, can you tell us just what you believe to be some of the key elements of the strategy?
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. It's a real pleasure to be with both of you today. I think if you take a step back to really process the strategy itself, I think it makes a number of, really fundamental shifts. But, on one hand, it really tries to shift the responsibility, right, from, bearing the burden of security and all the costs of security from the end user to, those who are more or well positioned, right, to take on those costs. So like the big actors in our system. It looks to kind of change the incentive structure. Right now, and I know we'll sort of unpack this later on, but right now a lot of cybersecurity goals and guidance is voluntary, right? So what are the shifts that we need to make there in terms of incentives and requirements? And then it also really makes some strategic investments in our future. So from workforce to technology and other research and development, as well as other organizational shifts as well. So looking at the strategy and to the people, especially Brian and everyone who worked on it, I think it's a really key piece of policy guidance.
Thank you for that, Lauren. And Brian, same question to you to start us off.
So I think building on what Lauren said, and I think she's spot on, a couple of pieces, this is really building on previous work. It's building on the previous administration's 2018 cybersecurity strategy. It's building on activities and actions from this administration from the very first days. When the Biden-Harris administration came into office, a few things happened, very quickly. One of them was the executive order on improving the nation's cybersecurity, which had a lot of activities for the federal government, but also good pieces for and good activities for the private sector to leverage and learn from as well. And then the second one was the National Security Memorandum on improving the cybersecurity of critical infrastructure control systems. Both of those documents and pieces of work really helped inform this strategy. And as Lauren said, there's the two huge shifts here really are taking that responsibility and adjusting the responsibility for cybersecurity roles and responsibility, which have largely been devolved down to, the lowest end user, every end user, and shifting that responsibility to those who are really better capable of and better positioned to be able to address that and mitigate that risk. So software developers, large entities, cloud service providers, those entities who, if we can shift that burden to a degree so that they pick up a better piece of that responsibility, that is a more appropriate and effective way of working through this. And then the other piece that Lauren mentioned, which again, I'd like to emphasize, is this investment in the future. So we need to protect what we have today, but we want to shift from being reactive to being proactive and looking to where, the future is. So we're going to still need to defend systems of today, but we need to make that investment in the future, looking at advanced technologies, looking at resilience, increasing resilience. Secure by design and secure by default are two key aspects of this. So again, not just being reactive, but really looking forward and being proactive as we move forward.
Fantastic. Thank you both for kind of foundationally setting this discussion up for us. So as you both have mentioned, the shifting of the burden and the looking for improvements within existing systems. And can you kind of detail, let's start with you this time, Brian, which agencies are responsible for what task and what mandates as a part of the strategy?
So as we move forward, we're in the process. If you look through the strategy, you're going to see there's 5 pillars in there with 27 strategic objectives. And underneath each one of those strategic objectives, there's going to be at least one, and in most cases, several initiatives. So the Office of the National Cyber Director has been leading an interagency process, working with interagency partners to develop an implementation plan. That implementation plan will include initiatives, and those initiatives will be clearly laid out. I would note that within the strategy itself, there are both explicit requirements and tasks in the strategy, as well as implied activities and actions. So our team is working through developing the implementation plan for that. And once that plan is finalized, expected sometime this summer, that will be made publicly available. We'll lay out what the initiatives are. It will outline what agencies have primary responsibility and which agencies are consulted. There's a wide variety of agencies that are involved here, to include, what I would say are the usual suspects. It's DHS, it's NSA, it's CISA, FBI, NSA. There's a wide range of different activities and responsibilities across these 27 strategic objectives and the initiatives that are nested underneath them.
Fantastic. Thank you for that. Lauren, do you have anything you want to add or any additional thoughts on that?
I think that Brian laid that out really well. I think, as we're working through, this plan for implementation, and obviously, where the different sector risk management agencies and, across the interagency have been working on, in their respective areas, I think that's where it's going to, really make sense. And I think the public will see that when it comes out.
Okay, fantastic. So based on this, you've spoken a lot about the shifting of the burden. We've kind of gone through this and talked about some responsibilities from the government side, but how will agencies partner with industry, and what role will that public-private partnership information sharing mechanisms play throughout this whole process as laid out in the strategy? And let's start with you on that one, Lauren.
Sure. Yeah, so, especially for CISA, right, our success really hinges upon our partnerships with, across the, federal agencies, across state and local, across private industry. So collaboration is huge. And, you talk about the speed and the scale of intelligence sharing and collaboration. This is a really important aspect. And I think, from a bi-directional standpoint, right, it can't just be all, federal government pushing out, nor can it just be, other sort of entities pushing it back, right? It has to be true collaboration. I will sort of take a page from General Stanley McChrystal, it takes a network to defeat a network, right? So I look at, in the cybersecurity strategy, we're talking a lot about federal cybersecurity centers and, other mechanisms to be able to have these relationships and to collect that information, share that information, and work on things together. But, as the nation's cyber risk advisor, again, these partnerships are really, really vital, to help us buy down that risk. And, where we will work with industry a lot, we definitely need industry to really be a leader here. And then as we look towards the implementation of CERCIA, that's going to be huge for, getting that information as well. So, there's a lot of work to be done here, but also, as Brian alluded to before, a lot of work that has been done, and I'm really looking forward to seeing how that all plays out.
Okay, and Brian, to you.
Yeah, so let me expound on that a little bit as well. The collaboration piece, the public-private partnership has been foundational to how we've, secured critical infrastructure for, 20 years. It is a key piece, and it will remain a key piece. But one of the things that we're looking at, as Lauren mentioned, was really achieving that public-private collaboration at scale, at speed and scale. So, one of the things that we've been focused on for years has been information sharing. And information sharing is important. It is one of those key fundamentals, but it's just not enough. So what we're really looking at is moving the needle to actually shifting to true operational collaboration, not just information sharing. So, what does this mean? This means the public experts and private sector experts sitting side by side to really look at how we do exercises, planning, defensive operations, and really understanding that. So we've already made some significant moves forward on that. CISA has got the Joint Cyber Defense Collaborative, the JCDC, which is really moving out in this collaboration area. The energy sector has the Energy Threat Analysis Center, ETAC. It's a pilot, but again, it's looking towards that same piece of collaboration. And then the National Security Agency has the Cybersecurity Collaboration Center, which really is looking at the defense industrial base and its service providers and how it can, again, enhance collaboration. So there's plenty of collaboration that needs to go around. One of the key things we need to do is to make sure that we do this in a synergistic way that is coordinated, value added, that we don't create stovepipes. So that's where a lot of this is going on. There is not one single model that's going to work. These are all a little bit different, but they all need to be integrated in a way. And we're also looking at how we then integrate our federal cyber centers and how we ensure that not just the federal cyber centers, but these collaboration centers are integrated in a way, again, that adds value across the ecosystem and really moves the needle forward.
Well, see, there's some interesting points here. I want to I'll pull this thread a little bit more when you speak of the need for the overall shift, and information sharing hasn't necessarily been enough as we've been moving forward with industry and with the private sector. So why is voluntary cybersecurity enhancements, where have they not been adequate? Has there been problems that have persisted that have made it necessary for the shift to take place? And why are the cybersecurity mandates in and of themselves necessary from you? And Brian, if you don't mind starting with that.
Sure. I mean, I'd be happy to talk to that. So, like I said, the voluntary piece to this, the voluntary approach has been fundamental to what we do, and it will remain so. However, I think we also recognize that, the public-private partnerships and collaboration alone are not really adequate to address the evolving cyber threat landscape. And we've had, the simple fact is that despite all of voluntary collaboration, despite all of that work we've done, the critical infrastructure of our nation is still not adequately secure and resilient. So, how do we see this play out? I mean, we've seen this play out in multiple cases, and we see it playing out every day. Ransomware is a key piece. If we look at Colonial Pipeline, JBS Foods, the SolarWinds issue, Hafnium, there's a whole sequence of events here where it's a call to action for really looking at how we're addressing it. And that's in part the way the strategy has laid it all out. But when we talk about the need for mandates, we actually see that, properly crafted regulations that set a threshold or a baseline for what every entity ought to be making is one of those key pieces. And we think that is a need, but we also don't think that it's the only tool, right? It's one of several tools. But I would say that, again, to emphasize, that the threat environment is outpacing the ability of market forces and purely voluntary regimes to address the threat. So that's where we're looking at, examining where cybersecurity regulatory requirements may be appropriate and then taking action. So we've had a lot of discussions about this. We've had discussions with the independent regulators and with the interagency partners and with the private sector as well. So the key thing, there's some key principles really to regulatory regimes. And those are that they must be outcome oriented, they must be risk informed, they should be performance based, they should be tailored to the specific needs and economics of the sector of which they're addressed. They need to be, and then they also need to be harmonized to the maximum extent possible. So this harmonization piece means that, we understand and we want to make sure that those that are regulated and those that are regulators, we minimize the burden and the cost for both the regulated and those regulators. So how can we look at applying, again, we've talked a lot about the NIST cyber, well, we haven't talked about it here, but there's been a lot of discussion about the NIST cybersecurity framework, about CISA cybersecurity performance goals. We're looking for, again, basing the regulatory requirements on, as appropriate, on a common set of guidance and a common set of standards, if appropriate, that, again, apples to apples as we try and move forward, harmonizing them across different regulators so that entities that are subject to multiple regulators, we minimize the burden on them.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for that. It was very in-depth. Lauren, your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, if we kind of look at economics, right, and behavioral economics, first, as Brian was just saying, harmonizing those regulations, it makes it easier for people and organizations to actually take those and implement them, right? But also, looking at the way that this has been previously done, right? Most of these organizations, a lot of small, medium businesses, micro businesses, they simply have not had the resources to be able to prioritize security in their organizations. And so, purely from an economic standpoint, right, people aren't going to necessarily do what is maybe good for the collective, but going against their own self-interest. So, it's has been a rational decision, even if it, doesn't necessarily benefit society. And so how can we actually change that? We need those market interventions, right, to start to shift towards better security. And I'll say in, previous roles and talking with, different stakeholders, they have expressed, once there is a rule or a law, then we can actually then really dedicate resources towards that because it'll then be a need to have instead of just a nice to have, right? It has to be a part of, those business decisions. So yeah, I agree with what Brian said, and I think that will lead to better outcomes. Of course, it's not the only thing that we need to do, and I think Brian would agree with that. It's just kind of one tool in the toolkit.
Fantastic, thank you. So with that said, how should operators look to manage some of these added costs? Because we're talking about a burden shift, we're talking about additional responsibilities even within this public-private partnership. So how should they look to manage some of these costs? And then how can government provide incentives when it relates for a key, critical infrastructure, a key requirements to enhance the cybersecurity overall? So basically, within this collaborative state, what is it that government can do to incentivize the private sector to really engage on these key requirements? And how can operators manage some of these new additional costs?
Do you want me to go?
Yeah, Brian, you're up.
I'll go first.
Not all at once, please.
Okay. So there was a lot in that question. The first thing that I would say is, what can entities do now? There is a wealth of information for stakeholders, critical infrastructure owners and operators to leverage to advance, to really examine their cybersecurity posture and advance their cybersecurity posture. The NIST Cybersecurity Framework 2.0 under development is a great tool to look at. I would also say that CISA has an enormous amount of material. If you go to the Stop Ransom, at the start of the continuing war on Ukraine by Russia, there was the Stop Ransomware campaign that CISA has posted a whole host of great resources that entities ought to be using. And there's some real simple guidance in there. Again, some of it will take, and it ranges from very simple to much more detailed, right? But it's a starting place. The other thing that CISA has done, is directed by the President's National Security Memorandum, was in coordination with NIST, develop cybersecurity performance goals. Again, there's some great checklist tools in there for entities to start building out, especially small, medium businesses, to start building out their cybersecurity posture. When we start now shifting towards, well, what about the incentives and what about the other pieces? So, some of that is, from the private sector, some of that's a government responsibility, and we recognize that. So, we've looked at things such as, what can we do to incentivize? Well, one of the things that we did, for example, is looking at, federal procurement and, trying to incentivize through federal procurement, trying to incentivize by federal grant programs. We're looking at that. We're also looking at such things as, developing programs that will help, such as, looking at IoT, labeling, looking at things along that nature that can provide like a good seal of approval or an incentive for, an entity to go ahead and build out cybersecurity into their systems. So those are just a couple of things. I'll stop there.
Yeah, what I would add on to that is, this is the whole reason behind, or one of the reasons, I guess, behind secure by design and secure by default, those efforts, right? Because we recognize that this is very expensive, not only, for an organization that's actually impacted by cyber attacks, but also in preparation, right? Preparing your organization to deal with them. It's expensive. And that is something that we believe it's, not necessarily fair for the end users to be bearing that burden. And so, our whole reason for wanting to shift that burden is to, eventually, right, take those costs and distribute them to the actors who can better absorb them. In the short run, though, I think that, we as a nation, right, need to really come together to determine how we're going to support critical infrastructure, going forward, right? Like, I think the state and local cyber grant is going to be really foundational for a lot of state and local entities that have critical infrastructure, especially at the municipal level. What about going forward, right? And obviously with CHIPS and Science money, that's going to be a huge investment as well. So we're making these foundational investments that I think are going to be, really fundamental. In the long run, again, working towards secure by design, looking at, how we can change the open source software security ecosystem, looking at workforce, right? So making these short and long-term strategies to help to mitigate those costs. But yes, I mean, ultimately, there are costs to security right now. And again, we need to work together, figure out really how we're going to decide who's going to take on, those burdens going forward.
That's really, I'm sorry, go ahead, Brian, please.
Let me just add on one more thing. We can do, as we look at how do we incentivize, right? Market forces really need to drive this, but we, the markets, need to reward those who are doing the right thing versus those who are not doing the right thing. So you look at, for example, as Lauren just mentioned, secure by design, secure by default. Those are key pieces, right? We ought to be looking at rewarding those who do that both across the market system to include federal procurement and other things. We ought to be rewarding those who are doing that and incentivizing others to do it. And I think that's going to be one of the more important pieces of the strategy implementation plan as we move forward on what are the initiatives we can do to move those forward.
Yeah, and Laura, I know you've already kind of hit this, but that's a really key point that Brian brings up, and about the implementation recommendations and how it relates to security by design. Can you just speak even for like a quick 30 seconds on what CISA is doing around those aspects?
Yeah, so you might have seen recently, it was, gosh, I think 2 weeks ago now, time sort of flies, but CISA just released a white paper with secure by design and secure by default principles. And that is really, putting sort of the stake in the ground. Here's what we think, but there's so much work to be done around that. So much, it's a great point, our jumping off point for discussion with industry, with state and local, with universities, right? The entire ecosystem. And that's part of the plan going forward, is having those conversations to be able to design, programs and design how, we're going to tackle this as an ecosystem going forward.
And let me just add on top of that one thing. Not only did, CISA did this and they released it, it was 2 weeks ago, I think it was April 13th,
Yeah.
but it was done in coordination and conjunction with FBI, NSA, and I think 6 different countries. So this, and I think that's hugely important. This isn't a stovepiped activity. This is, consensus, a consensus document that has a lot of folks looking at it, both from a domestic standpoint and an international standpoint. So I think it's great. It's picking up steam, and it's the kind of market force that can help drive the market forces to what we really need moving forward.
Fantastic, thank you, folks. And with the time that we have left right now, we want to go ahead and move on to some audience questions. And we want to take just a quick thank you to AT&T. That's been our audience engagement sponsor. We can't do these types of virtual events without support from folks like AT&T. So we're very thankful. So we have a few here. We won't be able, unfortunately, to get into all of them, but one in particular, at least to start us off. To what extent does the voluntary approach to cybersecurity leave key critical infrastructure sectors, like water, for instance, vulnerable?
I can definitely take that. At this point, there are a lot of entities, because I'll just say this guidance has been voluntary, right? A lot of entities that have simply either not been able to prioritize security within their organization, or maybe haven't prioritized enough, haven't been able to put as many resources as they want to. Again, it's funding, it's expertise, and it's also, to Brian's point earlier, really understanding exactly what needs to be done. There's been obviously CISA has been putting out, these cyber performance goals, which I think are really important to help sort of, make things a little bit less confusing for entities. But yeah, the voluntary approach has led to this issue where a lot of our critical infrastructure, and organizations that are responsible for our safety and our security are not secured or not secured enough.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And I would say, water's a great example, right? I mean, the thousands and thousands, tens of thousands of water utilities across the nation, and many of them just do not have the resources. So again, that goes towards what we talked about earlier of trying to shift that responsibility up a little bit higher. But we have to work across, across multiple paths here. As we look at it, making tools available that can assist entities, coming up with systems that are, either managed service systems and services as items as a service that can assist. But we also need to start somewhere, right? So recently EPA, I think it was March 9th or so, issued a interpretive rule to the sanitary survey requirement, which includes cybersecurity. And I know that there's some in the water sector and some states who are not happy with that. I would argue that, you know, they need to start somewhere. We need to start somewhere. And we recognize there is this, you know, there is this tension between having a robust cybersecurity regimen and being able to actually implement it. And this goes to a whole host of things to try to do that. And one of those is, which we haven't talked about yet, but I want to throw out there, is investing in the workforce. So I've had public sector utilities tell me that even if I have the money for the technology, I don't have the people that are able to do it. So, you know, ONCDE has been working on a national cyber workforce strategy. We've got the draft of that is in work and should be forthcoming in the coming months. And again, it's this key point that we need to invest in the future. We need, you know, cybersecurity actually needs to be like reading, writing, and arithmetic. Cybersecurity needs to be in there. It's a foundational element in our digital world. Everything we're doing now has a digital component to it, and we need to invest in people to be able to affect that.
Yeah, and I'll just say too, I'm really excited for that strategy to come out, and it's going to be, you know, really again a fundamental shift because there's so many elements of it that are sort of out of the federal government's hands too, right? That we really have to partner together as, you know, looking at these different ecosystems to actually make this happen. So it's going to be a real whole of society shift.
Fantastic. And I know we are really up on time, so I want to ask one more question from the audience really quickly and try to get as quick of an answer from you folks as we can. So 9 times out of 10, cybersecurity attacks happen when a user's credentials are compromised via social engineering, say for instance, phishing. Multi-factor authentication simply isn't standard. What can be done to improve the adoption of standard encrypted authentication methods between private companies? And let's start with you, Lauren, for your thoughts on this.
You know, again, this really goes to this whole idea of it shouldn't be on, you know, on one person, right? To guarantee the security and safety of, you know, of us all or of a whole company or things like that. So again, you know, what can be done, I'll say in the long term, again, is shifting that burden. So making our software, our products, our systems secure by design so that we don't have to worry about adding on a whole, you know, bunch of elements to make something secure, you know, on the user side. It's already done for you. And then again, you know, one person isn't going to be the weakest link and you know, cause a number of issues.
Yeah, I think that I agree with that. And I would also say, though, that, you know, there's a lot of multi-factor authentication out there. I think there is work being done to move that towards a standard. I think, if I'm not mistaken, I think it's Google, Microsoft, and another entity, might have even been Facebook, have all agreed to adopt the FIDO approach for multi-factor authentication, and they're moving towards that. I'm looking forward to it because I've got like 3 different multi-factor authentication tools, 4 multi-factor authentication tools, and it is a little bit hard sometimes to be able to use all those. They're extremely important. They're not so hard that I would not use them, but I think for everyday user, for every single account, having multi-factor authentication is absolutely key. I activate it on everything that I've got. I think Jen Easterly said that activating multi-factor authentication reduces your risk by like 90%. So yes, it is one of those initiatives. I'm not sure whether it's a specific initiative in the strategy implementation plan or not, but I will tell you that I know that the private sector also recognizes this and they're moving towards it.
And I'll just say too, real quick, you know, to your point, make it easy, right? Then more people will use it. It won't be so much of a burden.
And now that we're up against time, just want to make sure, do you, either of you have any parting thoughts, any final thoughts you want to share with our group here? for once, Coach White? Nothing.
I would just say thank you for the opportunity to talk to you, and thanks for those who are listening. I think it's an exciting time. You know, we've talked about this being the decisive decade. There's a lot to do here, and I think there's a lot of good work that's been done. We appreciate the private sector's interest, and we appreciate the stakeholders, critical infrastructure stakeholders, some of the folks that are on the follow-on panel. You know, the efforts that they've been making to, you know, really enhance and drive the nation's cybersecurity. It is an all-hands effort. It's a whole of nation effort, and that's where we really need to be moving.
Absolutely. Totally agree with that. Whole of nation effort, and really looking forward to working across the different sectors to make these initiatives come to life.
Well, thank you again to both of you so much for all the work that you have done and you continue to do. We really look forward to continuing to hear great things from you in the future, and hopefully you'll join us again in the future for another one of our sessions.
Thanks, Bishop.
Thank you.
Back over to you, Suzanne. Thank you.
And hey, Bishop, thank you. It's great to have you as part of the INSA team. Well done. And also just wanted to give a shout out to Lauren and Brian for taking time out of their afternoon to discuss the new cybersecurity strategy. I know I learned a lot so far. Now, speaking of learning, we are going to move on to our next panel of speakers. It is my privilege to introduce our panel moderator, my colleague and my friend, John Doyen, who joined INSA as our Executive Vice President back in March of 2020. So he just celebrated his 3-year anniversary with the organization. In John's capacity as Executive VP, he provides strategic oversight on all of INSA's councils, policy initiatives, and programs. He is a career NSA officer. He's held multiple senior leadership positions across the agency, as well as serving in assignments at the White House, CIA, the Pentagon, and NCTC, and overseas. John, who's actually sitting next to me next door, I welcome you, and we'll turn the camera over to you.
Well, thank you, Suzanne, and thank you for that welcome. And I'd also like to thank everyone who's joining us this afternoon. And I'd like to welcome our panelists who will be joining us here as they pop onto the screen. We'll have 3 panelists to provide an industry perspective on the new national cybersecurity strategy. So I'd like to welcome, let's see, going from my right across here, Amanda Craig, who's a senior director at Microsoft and is also works with the IT sector coordinating council. And then next to her, on my screen at least, is Chris Boyer, who's a vice president with AT&T, and he's also very active in the communications sector coordinating council. And we're also pleased to have Matt Eggers from the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, where he's vice president of cybersecurity policy. All 3 of these, I'm excited for this conversation because all 3 of these are intimately engaged in cybersecurity issues related to critical infrastructure and have a lot of ideas about the strategy. So let's jump right into it. And Amanda, we'll start with you. And I'd like for each of you to field this first question. And it's basically, you know, what's your view on the strategy? You know, does it, do you like what you see? Does it hit the mark? And is it addressing, from your perspective, the top needs and priorities that exist for critical infrastructure protection? Amanda.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Great.
Super. Thank you for confirming. You just never know. You want to talk for 5 minutes and everyone's like, whoa, whoa, whoa. So thank you for the opportunity to join. And thank you for, you know, the opportunity to comment on what I do think is a really powerful strategy. I like what both Brian and Lauren said in the last session in terms of the strategy building off of a lot of existing efforts, but you know, really also energizing a few areas that are, I think, really appropriate to focus on. A couple of those being what they touched on in terms of really strengthening operational collaboration, both across the public and private sectors and across the kind of public sector kind of centers of gravity there, as well as, you know, really focusing on ensuring that there's a high common baseline for security across technology providers, and really focusing on technology users, critical infrastructure in particular, also, you know, having more kind of certainty about their implementation of cybersecurity best practices. All of that seems like a very appropriate, you know, area of focus. I think that the other thing that I would really underline from what I've heard from our kind of national leaders in cybersecurity about the strategy that I really like is the recognition of a ton of work to do in implementation. So the strategy, obviously really important as a document that kind of really outlines all of the objectives, but the real work being in implementation, even in thinking about defining that high common baseline for security for technology providers. A lot of the quality of that work really depends on how that is defined and how it's implemented. Is it actually going to increase security and do so in a way that reduces those unnecessary costs across the ecosystem? So I also just want to say, beyond the strategy itself, I really appreciate the focus on the work of implementation that's still to come, the partnership that's needed across the public and private sectors to do that well.
Thank you. Chris, over to you. What are your views? Does this hit the mark? And what's your overall impressions of the strategy?
Yeah, I would say overall, anybody who's been following cybersecurity the last few years, has seen, just from reading the news, you can see all the increasing number of attacks that have occurred. Whether we start with the SolarWinds attack or we go to the big spat of ransomware attacks in 2020, 2021, there's just been a consistent theme of, ongoing cyber threats. So I don't think anyone can sit there and say that, hey, we shouldn't be going back and revising our strategy and updating it to reflect the current threat situation. And I think that's what Brian and the previous speakers kind of alluded to, is that we were kind of in a situation where the attacks are ratcheting up, and it was clear that something more needed to be done, in addition to that. And so I think, given that, some of the things in the strategy, like establishing kind of baseline standards for critical infrastructure, which, it theoretically raises the bar for security across the board. It gets you, it's not going to get you 100% of the way there, but maybe it gets you 70% of the way there, or whatever the number is. Doubling down on some other items in there around different technology solutions that should be used, like multi-factor, strong authentication. I think all those things are positive. At the end of the day, the implementation of the strategy is going to be, I think Amanda alluded to this, is going to be critical. How do we actually implement the strategy will be the issue that ultimately will determine its success. And the only other point I'll make is that I do think, as it's implemented, we need to be really careful that we don't end up throwing out some of the good things that come from the partnership process. And I don't think that's the intent at all. I think from what Brian was saying in the previous panel is, was it really an intent to kind of double down on that process, but complement it with some of these additional requirements to, cover some of the gaps that they're seeing with cybersecurity. But it is really important that we maintain the really positive things that are coming out of the partnership, like some things like the Joint Cyber Defense Collaborative that's going on, or other initiatives that CISA's running, where industry and government are working together. Because, like I said, you can only get a certain part of the way there, through regulatory action. There's always going to be that incremental 10-20% in cybersecurity where the threat actors are moving really quick. It doesn't lend itself well to regulation, and how do we react to that? And that's where the partnership is really critical, is that we have the speed and the flexibility to react in real time, as these things happen. That can be complemented by some of these regulatory actions that are going on, but I think you really need to do both.
Great. And Matt, what are your views?
John, thanks for having me, number one. I would say no surprises really with the strategy. I think second, I would say a word of thanks to the staff who wrote the strategy to really reach out to groups to kind of tap their thinking. That is so important, just to kind of listen before a strategy goes final. Kind of the two takeaway themes: rebalancing responsibilities, realigning incentives, makes perfect sense on a lot of levels. I think one of the things that we are trying to push is to make sure that any policy, piece of legislation or regulation that we deal with really balances interests. And it's not that hard when you think about it, but it's often easy to miss. If you think about kind of a scale, on one side, you've got some kind of, typically a government ask with some kind of enforcement mechanism, and industry or industries being impacted. Ideally, you want to have those things in balance, because then you can say, yes, you can move forward. I'd probably have my maybe my chamber cyber card taken away if I didn't note that, maybe it's me, but I think cyber policy, legislation, and regulation governance is really a kaleidoscope. There really isn't a whole lot of voluntary cyber out there in key critical infrastructure sectors. I understand what Brian and Lauren are getting at. I think they're kind of new parties into the kind of policy debate meets compliance requirements, given maybe a piece of legislation, maybe a special interpretation of existing authorities. And this is just at the federal level. We haven't gotten into what states are doing and international. And I'm going to run through some of them, but I won't do it right now because I want to make sure that folks on this panel here, the attendees, have an understanding of some of what that picture looks like. But I'll stop. Thanks.
Great. Hey, I want to get to the rebalancing of responsibility because I think that's a big part of this, and we should talk about that because most of the rebalancing is going to be on, well, people like Microsoft and AT&T. But I did want to get back, though. We've all talked a little bit about the implementation. Amanda, a ton of implementation. Chris echoed that. And I recall, I think it was Brian said, basically they're working on implementation plans for this summer. And to the point you made, Matt, about the engagement, are you also seeing the staffs reach out to engage industry on the implementation piece and making sure that as that is fleshed out, that you have a voice as one of the obvious stakeholder in all of this? Is that happening?
I guess it probably depends on the issue. But for example, I don't know about you all, but if I'm going to do any reading, I'm going to go hide away at a coffee shop for a few hours. And I did this morning. And so, when we really wrestle with issues, there is no substitute for literally sitting down all together and looking at something like the Secure Software Development Attestation Form Instructions, a 10-page document. And unless we're all sitting there together, if we're impacted by it and we say, what are the pros and cons? What don't we understand? We are really challenged to have a fairly good feel for why certain organizations, including the Chamber, come down on certain issues. But I think on balance, yes, our door is always open, and I think administration folks are making themselves available, which we really appreciate.
Great. Hey, Chris and Amanda, through your work on the different sectors that you're coordinating councils, are you able to have some insight into the implementation? You feel that industry has a voice there?
I do. I mean, I think from a comm sector perspective, I mean, we're certainly engaged with our sector partners. So talking with, our sector specific agency is really CISA. So we're having those conversations, and I'll let Amanda speak to IT, but I think they're in a similar situation. And, it depends. It does depend to Matt's point on the issue. So depending upon the topic, there's different issues that are raised. So, the big things that affect us are the kind of sector specific performance goals. CISA already issued performance goals for cross sector. Now they're working on sector specific. I think they're getting around to comms on their short list. So at some point we'll be engaged with them on that. And we continue to engage with them on a variety of other things, about information sharing and kind of ongoing operational collaboration. So I do think that that's happening. I do think, though, it is really important that to make sure there's buy-in across the board on cyber, that these things are shared and that there is a collaborative environment and input from industry is taken into account as these different things are developed.
Yeah, and I would just echo that. I mean, I totally agree. I think there's been really good engagement through the IT Sector Coordinating Council and other forums on a lot of pieces of work related to the National Cybersecurity Strategy implementation. There are also, the listening sessions that CISA held last week at RSA, lots of different kind of public-private partnership opportunity kind of forums. I also am, sympathetic to the fact that I'm sure there's a lot of work happening across the interagency process, right, where they're trying to work through some of their plans and an intention to kind of bring the private sector in and kind of as that work goes forward. And that's a very complex process to manage, I am very sure. But I guess the thing I would say is, just underlining what Chris said, I think there's been a lot of good partnership. There's can never be enough. So looking forward to more as the kind of, real rubber meets the road kind of work of implementation gets underway.
Thanks. Hey, well, let's go back now to talk about one of the key aspects of the strategy, which is this rebalancing or the moving of responsibility to what the strategy calls the major players. And can you say some more about that, and from your sector's perspectives or from the Chamber's perspective, Matt? What's your views on the shift of responsibility and how that is being received? And we can start back with.
Yeah, I'm glad you asked. I've been working on a document around rebalancing to try to do two things. Try to lay out kind of a simple vision for what good policy looks like, policy being a catch-all for a lot of what we do, while capturing at least some of the recent policy, legislation, regulation. And I'd be remiss if I didn't say, for example, banking and financial services folks, they are underwater by a number of regulation, supervisory requirements, to the extent that by some indications, they're spending 50% of their time on compliance. I want to stop there and say, we don't have a problem with baseline requirements. Baseline requirements can be good. They just continue to grow, and it's hard to kind of keep them from becoming fragmented or becoming adopted by more than one agency, not only at the federal level, but state and international. The chemical sector has the CFATS program. It's up for renewal this year. We're going to go to bat for regulation that has a cyber requirement. The bulk power system is governed by requirements. FERC and NERC oversee that program. Medical devices. The FDA has cybersecurity requirements on medical devices. And the latest omnibus appropriations bill provides the FDA with authority to ask for a software bill of materials. There are many more, including supply chain interventions by policymakers. Those of you that are familiar with sections 889, 5949 probably know them well, and probably a number of your viewers are clearly probably familiar with the CMMC requirements. I'll stop. I think you probably get the idea. It's worth saying, because I think at the end of the day, what we want to make sure is that if there is a requirement, it's a fair one. There are legal liability protections that come with it. There's harmonization, and in some cases, federal preemption or a mixture of those different attributes. Now, that won't work for everyone, but it's something to think about in terms of rebalancing the ask and the requirements that businesses have to abide by. I hope that helps.
Okay. Hey, Chris, do you have a view on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think overall on the sector side, we're going to have to see how this plays out, right? But I think in terms, I'm sorry, I just lost my train of thought all of a sudden. Too many beeps going off on my phone right now. My bad.
The cyber attack somewhere.
You have a minute ago, and I'll get myself back.
Yeah. Let me jump in. So I feel like we'll probably have a similar place, because I'm kind of with where I think you are going, Chris, which sort of aligns with where I started in terms of having a high common baseline makes a lot of sense. This area of focus makes a lot of sense. Implementation matters a lot. I think about a few things as really important for mandates that improve cybersecurity while kind of minimizing those costs. And I don't just mean financial costs, by the way. I also mean impact to operational security versus having security resources be overly diverted to compliance exercises, which obviously impacts the whole ecosystem in terms of costs. And the three things that I would say are really important to the how to kind of get this right are the actual security requirements, right? I think Chris made a good point at the outset about, threat actors evolving so fast, and that being one of the reasons why having regulatory action sort of be something that is addressing the kind of risk that is quickly evolving in the cybersecurity space. The best way to try to get at that, of course, having more kind of outcome-focused, risk-based requirements that can allow tech providers to evolve with threat actors, although that's always going to be challenging. But good security requirements are, of course, a foundation. I think what Brian said in the first session in terms of principles there, really positive. And I think for the security by design space, we have really good kind of foundational standards like the NIST Secure Software Development Framework that was evolved for the May 2021 executive order. So that's a foundation. The other two things, though, that I think are really important are, one, good kind of conformance verification processes, and two, the kind of alignment of requirements and those verification processes across geographies, across sectors, but also across technology types. So I want to focus on the second one and then come back to the first one, because I think, I was very positive in the National Cybersecurity Strategy that there was so much focus, and there has been, and the kind of conversation since the strategy was released about the importance of harmonization, which is really great, right? But I think there's a lot of complexity there to unpack in implementation. It's great that we all have the same intention, but there's a lot of attention, I think, nationally on having consistency and interoperability across sectors, which is great foundation, but hard enough in itself to implement. There's the kind of international consistency and interoperability, which I think is even harder, right? Because then you also have the kind of across every country having the sectoral challenge layered with the kind of coordination at the international level, and a lot of these policies and regulations being developed in concert across different geographies, making that kind of coordination really complex. It's not like there's a standard that's done that everybody can just easily point to cover the entire spectrum of what they're trying to cover here. There are some good reference points that hopefully governments are going to reference in implementation, right? But there's also this, desire to continue working on this concurrently, which makes alignment really hard. And then the last piece I would say is, across technology types, like we're seeing a lot of efforts to kind of address horizontal technology, like all software or all connected devices with software or all cloud services or, critical cloud services or, and all of that in some ways is different and in some ways interrelates, and how those requirements and conformance verification processes work across all of those dimensions, I think is really tough. And then coming back to the conformance verification piece, I think this is one where a lot of times that's punted until, okay, we are focusing on developing the requirements, and then later we'll think about kind of the attestation process, and that makes sense. But I think we're going to really do ourselves a disservice if we don't start thinking about the verification process now and the mix of methods that we're probably going to want, and addressing the whole ecosystem, everything from kind of self-attestation, voluntary approaches, to more kind of, burdensome, intensive, costly processes that nevertheless we want, considering the risk scenario that we're dealing with. So like certification or other mechanisms, and really working out like, how do we want to do that? Do we have the resources? Is there work that we could do now to kind of strengthen automation in some of those processes to ensure that we can scale the way that we'll need to? I think that really deserves attention more at the outset as we're kind of structuring the work in this space. And so I would just go back to the security requirements themselves, the conformance verification, and then the alignment across both of those things, sectorally, internationally, and across technology types.
Great, thanks.
Yeah, and so I agree with everything Amanda said. I'll just add a few comments, and at the risk of leaving my phone on my desk and getting pinged by Microsoft Teams for the last 10 minutes by our internal. But,
all right.
Hey, well, no, I mean, on the issue of shifting more of the responsibility, to some of the more capable players, I'll just briefly touch on that. I think it's definitely true that there's an element of industry that is probably, better situated than others in terms of some of these issues, right? And so I don't have any objection to that per se, but I will say that I do think it's more complicated than it may seem on the surface level. And so, like, just speaking for an ISP, there's certain issues that we certainly admit that we have a role to play in protecting in certain areas, right? So think of like some of the things in the strategy where it talked about internet protocols and things like BGP security or DNS security. There's certainly things that and a role for ISPs in that space, but I think going, Amanda, to your point, it's like, I don't think that it's not a one size fits all type of scenario, right? Like each part of the ecosystem has to step up and do certain things in order for these different issues to be resolved. So it's not as simple as saying, if I just make the software companies, do more in terms of software security, if I just make the ISPs do more on routing security or those things, that all of a sudden we move into some panacea that everything's going to be resolved, right? And each one of those issues requires a multitude of players, to step up and do certain things on security. So while I think it's important that we think about, how do we move some of that security capability into the more capable players, agree with that strategically, I think depending upon the issue, you really have to look at it issue by issue by issue and drill down on what are the roles of the different players in the ecosystem, what things can different parties bring to the table, what solution sets do they have, what are they technically capable of, and devise kind of a holistic strategy for those issues. That's the only way you're going to be successful. And I think that unfortunately that makes it fairly complex. It's kind of the nature of the beast, but I think that's ultimately what's necessary.
Hey, Jack, can I riff on what they just said, if I may,
Absolutely.
quickly? And I'll try to give you bring it to maybe two concrete examples. So Amanda rightly talked about requirements, conformance, alignment. Chris mentioned, among other things, capable players. I'm at the U.S. Chamber. The Chamber membership ranges widely from small entities that struggle even to think about cyber on a daily basis to the sophisticated entities on this call. I've got a number, and I'm going to talk about, let's say, IoT security and maybe reporting. So we probably would be remiss not to just say, I always want to hear what Brian and Lauren and others want to say. I want to try to be as helpful to them as I can. And most of the time that involves making sure we leave ourselves a lot of time to listen and go through things. Our effort collectively, public-private, on helping out Ukraine on cyber is tremendous. I'm looking at organizations, perhaps on this call, that are spending a lot of resources voluntarily to help out the Ukrainians. And let's face it, it's good for Ukraine. The Chamber's doing stuff for Ukraine. It helps us in the event of maybe future kinetic activity in the broader region. On IoT, requirements, conformance, alignment. A number of years ago, the Chamber put out an idea that, hey, if there are going to be requirements for IoT devices, give entities the option of choosing from globally accepted, public-private accepted standards, frameworks, requirements, let them conform, build to certain specs, and give them protections. A range of protections. That's good. Everyone comes away getting more. Policymakers get the requirements they want. Industry gets the protections that they want. Will it work for everyone? Perhaps not, but it's heading us in the right direction. Cyber incident reporting. Here's what good cyber incident reporting looks like. Certain critical infrastructure entities provide incident reporting into CISA in a way that's protected. It's protected from public disclosure. There are liability protections. What's an example of where it maybe comes up short, perhaps well short? Providing material cyber incidents to organizations like the SEC in foreign business days when an organization may not feel like it's got an incident buttoned up. The issue isn't that the information goes to investors. That we get, but it's made public to bad guys too. So IoT, for example, incident reporting, for example, just to give you a feel for how we might look at a couple of different buckets.
Thanks for that. And also I want to let the audience know we have a few audience questions already, but if you have any more, send them in. I'll get to them in just a few minutes. But I had one other question coming up next, and that regards another part of the strategy, which is mentioned throughout the strategy, is talks a lot about incentives and the government using all of its tools, including reshaping incentives to achieve a unity of effort. Not a lot of specifics here. Maybe that comes in the implementation, but I'm curious what your thoughts are regarding the incentives that would be important and that you think would be valuable and that you'd like to see the government introduce for critical infrastructure operators. And thinking about that, let's maybe start with Amanda for this one.
Sure. So I think a range of incentives are really relevant for critical infrastructure and for other organizations in the ecosystem. I think government procurement is one that stands out because I think you look at the May 2021 EO 14028, a lot of work happening across software providers to ensure readiness to demonstrate conformance with those SSDF requirements because of that kind of procurement authority. So I think we have a real recent example of how that can incentivize providers in the ecosystem. But beyond that, I would talk about a range. I even think, in a way, really strong public-private partnership is actually an incentive, right? Because when you get industry and others in the ecosystem to participate in developing cybersecurity best practices or requirements, you get a stronger kind of buy-in, a stronger understanding. You have a more meaningful back and forth, so the actual guidance or requirements themselves are more operationable, more able to be operationalized by industry. Right? Thank you. Got there. Maybe. So like I think that's actually a foundation in terms of incentives. Yeah, I think having there be guidance on how to really meaningfully implement can be an incentive, right? Because you could have smaller providers that want to, but are just struggling with getting over that kind of uncertainty about how to. We talk about in the cybersecurity framework, which is something that we talk a lot about, as being a voluntary practice that is widely adopted across industry. States have experimented with some different incentives to drive adoption there, things like tax credits or grants that I think have worked in some circumstances. Public recognition of implementation of best practices, I think, is another one that can kind of be reinforcing. So I think a range, right, from that kind of just foundation to how you're building the practice that you want to incentivize adoption of, all the way up to government procurement and a lot of stuff in between.
Great. Thank you for that. Chris, what about your take on incentives?
Yeah, I agree with Amanda on things like buying into the partnership creating buy-in and the ideas of procurement. I guess the one thing I would add to that list would be around regulatory safe harbors. So this is the idea that, if the government's going to impose baselines and new regulations, if companies are compliant with those regulations, they should be viewed as being good actors when it comes to security. And what you don't want to see happen is a situation where there's additional regulatory risk layered on top of these baseline requirements and other things. So I think if you are in the mindset of doing that, and I think it's very similar to how the NIST cybersecurity framework played out, until recently. When NIST issued the cybersecurity framework, they put it out, and the Federal Trade Commission actually went, or the FTC, so they went and they basically did a blog post where they kind of benchmarked to the cybersecurity framework and said, consumers have a reasonable expectation of security. And they talked about how, I'm paraphrasing here, so I don't want anybody from the FTC to say I got this wrong, but they basically said something to the effect of how one way to show that you're acting reasonably is to follow the guidance of the NIST cybersecurity framework, which effectively created an environment where companies had an incentive because it would help them deal with these types of issues, right? So I think regulatory safe harbors or linking into those things are actually also really important. And then you have just kind of overall, I think Amanda touched on this, is the collaboration with government. I do think that a lot of companies, including mine and others in my industry, recognize that we have a major role to play here. And the more that we're part of the process, the more we're going to be bought in on the process.
Okay. What about you, Matt, thinking about incentives, especially you had mentioned how the Chamber works with so many small businesses. Any take on that?
I would love to see a program. Probably we would need some kind of piece of legislation where private entities of any stripe could show conformity with some kind of program, and they get a measure of liability protections based on the nature of the conformance requirement. And why do I say liability protection? So if you think about it, cyber's a little different, right? So in a lot of ways, you might say justice, or the fact that companies are on the front line of dealing with nation states, their proxies, and criminal organizations puts them in a different category. Another thing, correctness. If the requirements are correct, then entities, public entities, officials should not have a problem saying, if we stand behind our requirements, we'll give you protections. Third, I'd say there's probably a surplus of regulatory agencies relative to defenders. You guys just put out a terrific paper on private entities working with CISA, on private entities working with CISA and maybe Cyber Command. I think a key incentive for business isn't necessarily this idea of some kind of handout, if you will. It's to understand that when businesses hear from government, hey, we want to have you do something, there's an almost inevitable fragmentation. So the federal government has requirements, different agencies within the government may have similar requirements, that businesses might say timeout. And at the state level, like the New York Department of Financial Services has its revised requirements. And then we haven't even touched on the international space. So I'm the first one to say, when I hear, let's say, Brian and Lauren talk about some of the incidents that have happened over the last few years since the start of this administration, let's say, I'm with you. I hear you why you want to do what you want to do. On the other hand, issues around fragmentation and so forth really are in the back of people's mind and make people and organizations perhaps more resistant than they want them to be. I hope that helps.
It does.
Yeah, I just want to jump on Matt's point there. Like, the harmonization issue is critical, and I think there's been, I know DHS and CISA have folks that are already talking with other agencies about this, but it goes beyond just the federal level, right? It goes out to the states and international, and you know, it's becoming, I'll just say as someone who lives through this every day, it's becoming increasingly challenging to keep up with all the different requirements, you know, at all these different levels around the world and across the states in the US. There's a lot of different requirements being put on us, not just New York State with DFS, but they're happening effectively everywhere. And it's really difficult to keep up with. And I do think, I'm not sure that it's really moving the needle that much for security, because a lot of these things are just different twists on the same set of basic practices. And but it does create issues where you have to do compliance. You know, you have to have a compliance team that's checking the box in every single one of these entities on a lot of the same stuff. You have to file attestations showing that you're filing. It creates a pretty significant burden, which at the end of the day, I'm not sure it's really helping improve security necessarily. And so I think so the one thing government could really do to help us, I think, would be not advocating against the idea of baselines and those types of things, but having one that covers everything in the US anyway would be a big step in the right direction.
Hey, Chris, John, sorry to butt in, but I was just going to say, I was reviewing your latest NSTAC report where both AT&T and Microsoft have a play. What's the name of the office again you guys proposed to look at harmonization?
I think regulatory harmonization was in the name, right, Chris?
Yeah, it was, yeah.
Microsoft.
Harmonization, yeah, exactly. It's a tough issue, right? Because the federal government doesn't, you know, there's the preemption of the states is a huge deal. And like, I'm not going to get into political issues around that, but that's like, you know, but ultimately some sort of harmonization on the federal and state level would be really helpful to industry, because at least we would know what we have to comply with and do it once and do it right, and then not have to go do it 50 times. That's kind of obvious, but that's the reality we're dealing with.
Well, that's
Yeah,
a good.
oh, sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead, Amanda.
Just the one thing I wanted to underline that I think is really interesting from the NSTAC report, thanks for raising it, Matt, is it does recognize that this harmonization work is harder said than done. And in part, I think it's because all of this stuff is being developed in parallel, right? And so part of what the NSTAC report really calls for is having there be an office that actually specializes in helping federal regulators understand like how to translate between existing standards and the requirements that they're trying to make or develop, and then having there also be you know, a role, then likely ONCD as the kind of authority in this space to help like address when there are real inconsistencies, how to work through those. Because I think the other risk that I see is this: everybody wants harmonization, everybody gets why we need it, but because it's hard, there's also always a little flexibility too around like, you know, as feasible. And there could be like some good reason in some certain sectors to have, you know, some delta. And I don't think we want to say no to that, but we want to make sure that the way that that gets done is really rigorous.
Thanks. By we just had a question pop in. Is that report you're mentioning publicly available, and where can we find it?
Yeah, is it still the draft that's on publicly available, Chris, or have they actually published the final version? But
it's just the draft, but it's not going to change. The draft, it's only listed draft because it has to be officially, the way the INSA process works, has to be officially accepted by the president. So it's draft until that day, but it's not going to substantively change. It's on the INSA website, so you can just look up INSA on Google and it'll pop up.
Great.
Whatever
we have time. We're running out of time all of a sudden, but I was going to say it's interesting talking about all of the different compliance things, because the two questions audience questions we have in, one is basically regarding the zero trust mandate, what's working and what's not working, and the other question is what's happening with SBOM, the software bill of materials, and where are we with implementation of those set of new rules? So maybe I'll ask Amanda to do the SBOM, and I'll let Chris do zero, and then we'll wrap it up for our conversation. So Amanda, where are we with SBOM?
It's a really good question. So the requirement to deliver SBOMs to federal customers, right, is part of the May 2021 EO implementation. And it has been carrying forward alongside the broader kind of Section 4 implementation of that executive order. But there are a lot of challenges that are still being worked through in terms of how delivery of SBOMs is going to work and how they're really going to be used. And so I think it's an ongoing process, as is the rest of the Section 4 and the kind of attestation process that Matt was reading about this morning while having coffee. And so I think a lot of it is still to be determined exactly how that's going to be worked through in an agency by agency, kind of customer by customer kind of context, as well as I know there is a real vision, which we're really supportive of across the U.S. government, for having a more integrated view and really leveraging SBOMs for software supply chain security. And that is also going to take time building on that kind of customer by customer process. So we're working on it, but I'd say it's still very much in process.
Great. And what about the zero trust situation, Chris? Any comments on that?
I think a lot of that's been in the process of being implemented. I just put another plug in for INSA. The INSA actually did a report last year that talked about zero trust and the different issues around implementing zero trust for federal agencies. So INSA did a pretty serious deep dive into that issue, and I think a lot of the work is ongoing on implementing that. I mean, the only point I'll make about zero trust, for the audience's sake, is zero trust is really the mindset more than anything else. It's the mindset that you really consider nothing trusted on your network, right? So it's kind of really so from a technical perspective, it's kind of taking that mindset and applying it across all of your different across your entire network and all of your assets, and making sure you're kind of thinking of it that way. So when people are logging in and other things, you're not assuming that anyone's trusted, so they can roam throughout the network. You put things in containers. You have different strong authentication measures throughout. I mean, there's lots of different steps you can do, but those are all ways you implement a zero trust strategy. But I do think that there's a lot of focus on that, and it's really a mindset of how you think about engineering your network.
Great, thanks. Well, that's all the time we have for this panel, but I'll give everyone a chance for any closing thoughts, and we'll start with Matt. Any closing thoughts for us, Matt?
Two quick ones. One, thanks for having me, and good to be with you, Amanda and Chris. And folks should read your recent paper on cyber defense collaboration if they haven't. And then two, on harmonization, I'm a real big believer over time that I've come to believe that you got to be really easy on people trying to do this and really tough on the problem and the bad actors, right? Give everybody some slack, as I probably would say, the good actors, and everybody's trying hard, I think. On harmonization, quick word to say is the idea is we got to make it okay for agency chiefs to cede some ground on harmonization. So, for example, TSA, if we're going to move from 24-hour reporting under the pipeline requirements to, let's say, 72, you got to make it okay for the TSA to make that call, right? That's a decision that doesn't necessarily require a legislation or perhaps a new requirement, but make it easy. Anyway, I'll finish there. Thanks.
Thank you. And Chris, any last thoughts?
Yeah, just real simply, I really appreciate you having me here today. Good opportunity to speak to a really good audience about these issues. I think the one thing to keep in mind, I've been doing cyber policy work now for well over a decade, and I think at the end of the day, there's no perfect answer to this problem, right? This is an evolving problem that's going to constantly change, and I do think that we've made a lot of progress, but the nature of the beast is that the attackers shift and things change, and we're going to continually be challenged. And as the world becomes more and more connected by the day, the issues continue to morph. So I think it's really important that government and industry are working closely together on these issues, because it's just really complicated and an issue that there's never going to be a day that I can think of where we're just going to say, hey, we solved this problem, right? This is an ongoing evolutionary problem that is going to continue to evolve, and it just requires a lot of due diligence and a lot of partnership to stay out in front of it as best we can.
Great. And then Amanda, you get the last closing thought here.
And with that, wait, no, I would just underline the importance of implementation and partnership. So, I think, as we said at the outset, there's a ton of work to do on implementation to really, realize the outcomes that the strategy has outlined. And I actually, as the SBOM question that just arose is a good example, right, of this, where meaningful implementation takes a lot of time, and it really benefits from meaningful partnership, iterative partnership over that time period. And I think like what is called for in the national strategy in some ways really brings even more importance to that iterative partnership and working through these issues over time. We could have delivery of SBOMs today in some cases. I mean, Microsoft's ready. I know a lot of the folks in industry are ready. They're producing them, right? But we could have delivery in a check the box way, or we could have like real implementation work that's kind of work through the challenges that still exist there, right? And realize the value that's intended. And that's a lot harder, and that's going to take longer, but that's okay, because that's actually the outcome that we want. And so we need to do that, and we need to work through all those challenges in a way that's really collaborative. So thank you.
Well, thank you. And thank you, Amanda and Chris and Matt, and also everyone who joined us online. Thanks for taking some time this afternoon to join us here for this discussion. As a reminder to everyone, INSA, we have a cybersecurity critical infrastructure subcommittee that meets quarterly to address issues of common concern that as we discussed today. When the webinar ends, there will be a short survey that pops up. Please take a few moments to complete it and let us know how we did. Also, in closing, I want to share my condolences, as well as Suzanne did at the top of the program, to the family and friends of General Vince Stewart. Our INSA dinner this June will provide an opportunity to celebrate his distinguished career and honor his lasting legacy with his wife and children, friends, and colleagues. Regarding INSA events, you can learn more about all of them at our website, insaonline.org. This concludes this afternoon's program. Thank you, and have a wonderful day.